The wind on Thorne's ridge was a restless thing, carrying the scent of pine and the cold promise of conflict. It whipped at the fine wool coat of Alistair Jennings, a man whose wealth couldn't conceal the poverty of his character. He stood on Thorne's land as if he already owned it, two hired men flanking him like bored vultures. Alistair pointed a gloved finger, not at the tall lumberjack before him, but at Elara, who stood her ground beside the porch. "This entire valley will belong to me, Thorne. The railroad waits for no one, and this ridge is the final piece." His eyes, cold and dismissive as river stones, swept over her. "And as for your purchase," he sneered, the word dripping with venom, "you paid for damaged goods. A barren field is worthless, no matter who owns it. You should have left her in the dust where you found her." The air grew thick with a violence waiting to be unleashed. Thorne, who had been silent as an old oak, took a half-step forward, placing himself as a shield before Elara. His voice, when it came, was not a shout, but a dangerously low rumble that seemed to vibrate from the very earth beneath them. "This woman," he said, his gaze locked on Alistair, "has brought more life to this home in a single season than your entire bloodline has managed in a generation." He glanced back at the cabin, where the small, anxious faces of his children were pressed against the window pane. "Her worth isn't in a child she can bear, but in the family she can build from broken pieces. This is our home, and you will not touch it." The ultimatum hung between them, sharp and heavy as a falling axe. Can a quiet love born from desperation withstand the crushing force of greed and the cruelest ghosts of the past? Stay with us to discover the fate of Elara and Thorne. And if you believe in the power of a second chance, prove it with a like, a share, and subscribe to our channel for more stories from the untamed heart of the Wild West. The spring wind that swept across the plains of Cross Hollow carried no relief, only the stench of manure, cheap whiskey, and broken promises. It was a wind that clawed at Elara's worn calico dress and whipped strands of chestnut hair across a face already burning with a shame so profound it felt like a physical fever. She stood on a raised wooden platform in the center of the dusty market square, the same platform where prize-winning livestock were auctioned off. Today, she was the livestock. Her father, a man whose spine had been dissolved by debt and bitterness, stood beside her, his voice a coarse bellow that cut through the murmurs of the crowd. "She's pretty, but she can't bear children. What good is she? A barren tree." He shoved her forward, making her stumble. Laughter, sharp and cruel, erupted from a knot of dusty cowhands. Women whispered behind their hands, their eyes a mixture of pity and contempt. Elara's gaze fell to the cracks in the wooden planks beneath her feet, focusing on them as if they were the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into nightmare. The shame was not just for this moment, but for all the moments that led to it. She could still feel the phantom chill of her wedding dress being torn from her, could still hear the ice in her mother-in-law's voice. Beatrice Jennings, matriarch of the valley's most powerful ranching family, had pronounced the sentence in the cold, pristine parlor of their home, her words as sharp as shards of glass. 2 years. Not even a whisper of life. The Jennings line requires heirs, not decorative china. And Alistair, the man who had once whispered poems to her under a summer moon, had simply stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of weak compliance, unable to meet her pleading eyes. He had let his mother cast her out, thrown away like a spoiled meal because her body had failed a singular, sacred duty. They hadn't even let her stay until sunset. The new wife, Delilah, a girl barely 18 with wide, cunning eyes and a fertile laugh, had arrived before Elara's meager belongings were even packed. Now, here she stood, the dust of the market her new parlor, the scorn of strangers her new family. Half the price of a steer, folks. Her father barked, desperation making him ugly. She can cook, sew, and keep her silence. Anyone with enough coin can take her home tonight. Silence. A long, heavy, suffocating silence settled over the square. No one wanted a broken vessel. Then, the crowd parted. The sound of heavy boots on dusty ground, slow, deliberate, purposeful. A man emerged from the shadow of the blacksmith's forge. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his flannel shirt stained with pine sap and sawdust. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his face, but the jawline beneath was square and unyielding, carved from the same stubborn granite as the nearby hills. His hands were rough, scarred from hard labor. He stopped before the platform, and when he finally looked up, his eyes were not cruel, or leering, or even pitying. They were just tired. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion that seemed to understand the world for the unforgiving place it was. This was Thorne. He did not speak. He did not barter. He reached into the heavy folds of his canvas coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. The clink of coins hitting the rickety table was deafening in the sudden quiet. It was enough. Enough to silence the jeers, enough to silence her father. Her father, momentarily stunned, raised a greedy eyebrow. "You sure? She don't come with a refund." For the first time, Thorne's tired eyes settled on Elara, a long, assessing moment that held no judgment. He then turned his gaze back to her father, and his voice was low and flat, like the prairie itself. "She won't be judged anymore." That was all he said. He turned and walked away without a backward glance, the set of his shoulders implying the deal was done and he had no more time to waste. Her father gave her a final, rough shove. "Go on, then. You're his now." Picking up the small satchel that held everything she owned, a spare pair of worn shoes and a silver locket with her mother's face inside, Elara followed the silent man into the dust, her heart a cold, tight knot of fear and uncertainty. Was this mercy, or just a different kind of prison? His mule-drawn cart was tied outside the general store, its paint peeling, its wheels caked in mud. He didn't help her up. He simply waited, his patience as vast and unnerving as the sky. When she finally scrambled onto the hard wooden seat, he handed her a metal canteen without a word. The water tasted of tin and silence. They traveled for hours, the rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the soft clopping of the mule's hooves the only sounds between them. The prairie stretched on forever, a rolling sea of dry grass and leaning fences, under a sky that seemed to watch their small journey with a profound indifference. Elara stole glances at him. His face was weathered, etched with lines of sun and worry that made him look older than the 30 years he probably was. There was no wedding ring on his hand, just a white scar across one knuckle and a fresh splinter lodged near his thumb. The silence became a weight, and she finally broke it, her voice a fragile whisper. "Why? Why did you take me?" He didn't look at her, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "4 kids," he said, the words stark and devoid of emotion. "No mother. No time to find one the polite way." Elara's breath hitched in her throat. 4 children. She wasn't a wife, then. She was a replacement. A hired hand paid for with a pouch of coins. "So, I'm a governess?" she asked, the word feeling foreign and absurd. "No," he said, turning his head slightly, his tired eyes meeting hers for a second. "Just someone. Not cruel. That's enough." As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, they finally arrived. His home was not a cabin so much as a scar on the landscape, nestled in a grove of pine and cottonwood at the edge of a dark wood. The front porch sagged precariously. A broken wagon wheel leaned against the barn. Chickens scattered as they pulled in, their clucking a frantic, lonely sound. And then she saw them. 4 small faces peeking from behind a grimy curtain in the single downstairs window. 3 boys, 1 girl, all with the same wary, suspicious eyes. When Thorne stopped the cart, they spilled out onto the porch, a silent, hostile, welcoming party. "This is Miss Elara," Thorne told them, his voice flat as ever. "She'll be staying." The oldest boy, Gideon, who looked about 10, narrowed his eyes, his expression a perfect mirror of his father's stoicism, but edged with a boy's sharp defiance. The girl, Cora, clutched at his sleeve, hiding behind him. The youngest boy, a toddler named Finn, toddled forward and wrapped his small arms around Thorne's leg, a silent plea for protection from the stranger. Thorne lifted the boy with one arm and gestured toward the cabin with the other. "Room's upstairs. Warm water's in the bucket." Elara climbed the creaking stairs on legs that felt like jelly. The room was small, tucked under the eaves, with a single, small bed and a window that overlooked the dying fields. The air was cold and smelled of dust and loneliness. She sat on the edge of the thin mattress, her satchel falling to the floor. And for the first time that day, she wept. Not the loud, frantic sobs of before, but a soft, soundless weeping, tears of pure, unadulterated despair tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. She had been sold, bought, and delivered. She had not chosen this life, this man, these children. But as she lay back on the lumpy mattress, a strange thought surfaced through her misery. For the first time in weeks, no one was demanding anything from her. No one was measuring her worth. No one was asking her why she was broken. A chilling question followed the thought, settling deep in her soul as darkness consumed the small window. Had she been saved from the fire, only to be left to freeze in the endless cold? Dawn at Thorne's cabin did not arrive with gentle grace. It cracked open the darkness with a sliver of cold, gray light that revealed a world coated in frost. Elara awoke not from the light, but from the bone-deep chill that had seeped through the thin mattress and into her very marrow. For a disorienting moment, she didn't know where she was, the scent of pine and old smoke a foreign language to her senses. Then memory returned, a heavy, unwelcome blanket. She was the purchased woman, the silent governess. The barren field, a quiet determination, born not of hope, but of sheer survival instinct, forced her from the bed. Downstairs, the cabin was still steeped in shadow and slumber. A low fire smoldered in the hearth, a single red eye in the gloom. She saw the 4 children, tangled together in a pile of worn quilts and furs on the floor near the warmth, a litter of wild pups. Her first task, she decided, was to make a fire, to cook a meal. It was a simple act, a woman's act, something to prove she was more than the silent passenger from the day before. The reality was a brutal lesson in humility. The wood was damp, the kindling stubborn. Her hands, soft from a previous life of needlepoint and light housekeeping, were clumsy and weak. Smoke billowed into the room before the flames reluctantly caught, making her eyes water and her throat rasp. The cornmeal she found was coarse, and the bread she mixed with icy water and baked in a cast-iron skillet over the fire turned out to be a collection of charred, rock-hard discs. The bacon sizzled and spat, then quickly blackened into bitter strips of carbon. By the time Thorne and the children stirred, the air was thick with the smell of her failure. Thorne entered from the barn, his face grim from the morning cold, and said nothing. He took one of the burnt discs of bread, broke it with a sharp crack, and began to chew it with a slow, grinding motion, his jaw working methodically. Gideon, the eldest, smirked openly as he poked at a piece with a stick. Samuel, the second boy, a whirlwind of untamed energy, declared loudly, "It tastes like a burnt log." Cora, the girl, simply pushed her portion away, her large, sad eyes fixed on Elara with a look of deep disappointment. Only little Finn, too young for judgment, gummed a piece of bacon until his face was a smear of black grease. The silence that followed the meal was more damning than any scolding. Elara felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck. She had failed at the most fundamental task. She was, as Beatrice had sneered, merely decorative. In the days that followed, the cabin became her battleground. It was a place that held the ghost of another woman, Sarah. Elara could feel her in the way the curtains were hemmed with a neat, precise stitch so different from her own, in the worn patch on the armchair by the fire, shaped to a body that was not hers. One afternoon, while sweeping the thick dust from a high shelf, her fingers brushed against a small object. It was a bird, a starling, carved from a single piece of pine, its wings half spread as if about to take flight. But it was unfinished. The feathers were only partially etched, the eyes unpainted. It was a work of love, abandoned mid-creation. She knew, instinctively, that it was Thorne's work, and it had been for his late wife. The unfinished bird felt like a symbol for the entire house, for the family itself, a life of love, halted abruptly, left incomplete. The children remained a frontier she could not seem to cross. Gideon was the ringleader of the resistance. He saw her not as a person, but as an intruder, an imposter in his mother's home. He tested her with a silent, relentless campaign of small rebellions. He would forget to fetch the water, track mud across the floor she had just scrubbed with lye soap and her own raw determination, and answer her questions with a stony silence. Samuel was easier to read. He was a creature of appetite and energy, and if she could fill his belly and keep him from breaking his neck, he was content to mostly ignore her. Cora was a ghost, flitting at the edges of the room, her eyes holding a deep well of sorrow that Elara did not know how to bridge. Finn, the youngest, was the only one who showed a flicker of warmth. He would sometimes follow her from room to room, his chubby legs unsteady, his gaze curious. One afternoon, he toddled over as she was mending one of his brother's shirts, her fingers clumsy with the needle, and placed a single, wilted dandelion in her lap. It was a treasure, a peace offering. Elara's throat tightened, and she could not speak for a full minute. Her greatest trial came one evening as she was trying to lift a heavy pot of stew from the hearth. Her grip, weakened by a day of chores, slipped. The iron pot crashed to the floor, sending a tidal wave of hot, precious stew across the rough-hewn planks. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet cabin. The children froze. Elara stared in horror, her body braced for the inevitable explosion of anger. In her old life, such a costly mistake would have earned her a week of venomous words from Beatrice. She squeezed her eyes shut, waiting. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard Thorne's heavy boots approach. He squatted down beside her, looking not at her, but at the mess. He picked up the empty pot, his large, calloused hands gentle. "It's only stew," he said, his voice quiet. That was all. No anger, no disappointment. Just a simple statement of fact. He stood up, fetched a bucket and rag, and began to clean it up himself. The simple, unexpected act of grace shattered something inside Elara. Later that night, sitting on the porch in the biting cold, she cried again, but these were different tears. They were not tears of despair, but of a strange, fragile gratitude. Later still, as she tucked the children into their bedrolls, her hands shook a little as she pulled the quilt over Cora's small chest. On impulse, she began to hum an old lullaby her mother used to sing, her voice unsure at first, trembling like the wick of a dying candle, but growing a little stronger with each verse. Cora's tense body relaxed slightly, and Gideon, for the first time, watched her from his own bedroll with an expression that was not hostility, but confusion. A small whisper of change was in the air, a feeling that things might not have to be broken forever. But the prairie was a land that gave nothing easily. That night, the weather turned. The wind, which had been a restless whisper, rose to a mournful howl. The sky, which had been clear and cold, turned a bruised, angry purple. Trees began to lean and creak, their branches scraping against the roof like skeletal fingers. Rain began to fall, first as a light patter, then as a torrential, deafening downpour. Thunder cracked directly overhead, shaking the small cabin to its foundations. Inside, the fire sputtered, and the wind found every crack in the walls, filling the room with an icy draft. Elara huddled with the children, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. And then, through the cacophony of the storm, she heard another sound. A small, weak cough. It came from Cora. Elara reached out and touched the girl's forehead. It was burning. The child whimpered, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The storm outside was a terrifying force of nature, but Elara knew, with a sudden, gut-wrenching certainty, that the real storm, the one that could truly destroy them all, had just begun inside the walls of this cabin. The storm that night was a living beast, a screaming demon that threw itself against the small cabin with the intent to tear it apart. Rain hammered the roof like a frantic drumbeat, and the wind howled a song of utter desolation. Yet, the true tempest was inside, confined to the small, feverish body of Cora. The girl's skin was a parchment of fire, her breaths were shallow, rasping sounds that were nearly lost in the roar of the wind. Elara worked like a woman possessed, her earlier exhaustion burned away by a surge of fierce, protective adrenaline. She moved with a purpose she hadn't felt in years, her mind clear and sharp. She boiled willow bark to make a bitter tea to fight the fever, her hands steady as she strained the liquid. She crushed mint leaves she had found growing near the creek, mixing them with cool water to make a paste for the girl's burning forehead. But it was Thorne who truly frightened her. He stood by the hearth, a giant of a man rendered utterly powerless. He was frozen, his face a mask of stark terror, his eyes fixed on his daughter, but seeing something else entirely. Elara saw it then. He was not in this cabin, in this storm, but in another, colder room, in the dead of a blizzard years ago, watching the life fade from his beloved Sarah. The memory had him in its grip, a ghost strangling him into inaction. He was paralyzed by the trauma of his past failure, terrified that he was doomed to watch it repeat. Seeing his helplessness, Elara knew this fight was hers alone. She knelt by Cora's side, ignoring the storm, ignoring Thorne's silent agony, focusing only on the small, struggling child. "It's all right, little one," she murmured, her voice a low, constant hum of reassurance as she bathed the girl's face and limbs with cool cloths. "You just rest. I'm here. I'm not going anywhere." She did not know if the child could hear her, but she said it for herself as much as for Cora. Gideon, his face pale with fear, watched her from the corner, his earlier defiance completely gone, replaced by a desperate, silent plea. For hours she fought, a tireless sentinel against the encroaching darkness. She forced sips of the bitter tea between Cora's cracked lips. She held her small hands when the fever dreams made her cry out. She sang the one lullaby she knew over and over until her own throat was raw. The long night bled into a dawn that was unnaturally quiet. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily still. And in that stillness, Elara felt a change. Cora's breathing had deepened, evening out. The fire in her skin had receded to a gentle warmth. She was sleeping, a true, healing sleep. Exhausted, Elara slumped against the wall, her body trembling with the release of tension. When she looked up, Thorne was watching her, the haunted look gone from his eyes, replaced by an expression of profound awe, as if he were looking at a miracle. He took a step toward her, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he simply knelt, reached out, and gently squeezed her shoulder, a gesture that conveyed more than 1,000 words of gratitude. Later that morning, after Thorne had ridden into town at a frantic pace, he returned with Doc Ephraim. The old doctor, a kind man with wise eyes and a gentle demeanor, examined Cora thoroughly. He looked at the willow bark tea Elara had made and nodded in approval. "You did good, miss," he said, his voice warm. "Very good. You kept her here. Whatever they're paying you, it isn't enough." As he left, he paused at the door and looked from Elara to Thorne. "That one's a fighter, Thorne. And so is this one," he said, nodding toward Elara. "Don't you be a fool and let her go." The doctor's words hung in the air, a quiet validation that warmed Elara more than the morning sun. The next day, after Elara had gotten the children settled into a quiet game, she came downstairs to find a mug of steaming tea on the table. Beside it lay a small, crudely folded piece of paper. In stiff, uneven handwriting were 2 words. "Thank you." No name, no signature. But Elara knew. She clutched the note to her chest, the simple gesture a more powerful acknowledgement than any speech. The cabin began to change. The healing of Cora seemed to heal the family itself. Gideon's hostility vanished, replaced by a quiet, watchful respect. He started helping her with chores without being asked, his actions a form of silent apology. Life settled into a new, fragile rhythm. One afternoon, several weeks later, Thorne announced they were low on flour and salt. He needed to go to town, and he asked if she would ride with him. The request was casual, but it felt significant. It was the first time he had asked her to join him, not as a necessity, but as a companion. The air in Cross Hollow was thick with gossip, as usual. As Elara stepped out of the general store while Thorne waited in line for supplies, a voice, sharp and cruel as a whip crack, cut through the clatter. "Well, if it isn't the barren ghost herself." Elara froze. Beatrice Jennings stood before her, fanning herself with a folded newspaper, her eyes glittering with malice. Beside her stood Alistair, looking uncomfortable but saying nothing, and his new wife Delilah, who touched her own flat belly in a gesture of smug superiority. "Is that her?" Delilah asked, her voice loud enough for half the market to hear. Yes, Beatrice sneered, her gaze raking over Elara's simple, patched dress. Pretty, but cursed. Useless as a cracked jar. Couldn't give my son so much as a squalling pup. Elara's hands balled into fists at her sides. All the old shame, the humiliation, the feeling of worthlessness came rushing back, threatening to drown her. She wanted to shrink, to disappear. She turned to walk away, to flee, unwilling to give them the satisfaction of her tears. Then, a large, warm hand touched her shoulder. It was Thorne. He had stepped out from the shade of the store, dirt still clinging to his boots, his eyes like storm clouds. He looked at the two women without blinking, his presence an immovable wall of silent strength. Then he turned his gaze to Elara, and his voice, though quiet, carried across the square, clear and steady for all to hear. "She is the only one who can get my daughter to sleep through the night," he said, his words measured and deliberate. "The only one who taught my youngest son not to be afraid of the dark. The only one who can make a stew from nothing and have the boys asking for more." He paused, his grip on her shoulder firm and reassuring. "She is the only one who makes our house feel like it has a roof again." Beatrice and Alistair stared, momentarily speechless. The crowd, which had been listening with rapt attention, fell silent. In that moment, Thorne had not just defended her, he had declared her value, her irreplaceability. He had taken her private acts of love and care and held them up in the public square as treasures. He had taken her shame and transformed it into honor. Without another word, he gently guided her away, leaving her former family standing amidst their own poison. On the long wagon ride back, Elara sat in a state of quiet shock. The prairie landscape, which had once seemed so empty and indifferent, now looked beautiful, bathed in the golden light of the afternoon sun. She looked at the man beside her, the silent, weary lumberjack who had bought her for a pouch of coins. He was no longer just her rescuer. He was her defender. The dynamic between them had shifted, fundamentally and forever. She had saved his daughter's life, and he had just saved her soul. She had been reacting to her fate, surviving day by day. But now, as she looked toward the ridge where the small, lopsided cabin stood, she realized it wasn't just a place of shelter anymore. It was a home, and for the first time in her life, she had a home worth fighting for. The battle lines had been drawn in the dust of the market square, and she was no longer a passive victim. She was ready to fight. The long wagon ride home from Cross Hollow was steeped in a new kind of silence. It was not the empty, uncertain quiet of their first journey, but a dense, shared silence, heavy with the weight of the confrontation and the forge of a new, unspoken alliance. The world seemed to hold its breath around them. Elara could feel the warmth of Thorne's shoulder beside her, a solid, reassuring presence that anchored her in the swirling aftermath of the market square. She looked at his hands holding the reins, the same rough, scarred hands that had fought fever and fixed broken things, and saw them now as hands that would defend. He had not only stood for her, he had stood with her. The shift in the cabin's atmosphere was immediate and profound. It was as if Thorne's public declaration had given the children permission to fully embrace what their hearts already knew. Gideon, no longer a hostile stranger, now sought her out, showing her a hawk's nest he'd found or asking for help with a difficult knot, his requests a boy's clumsy way of seeking approval. Cora was her shadow, her small hand often finding its way into Elara's. The house was filled not just with the noise of children, but with the sounds of a family knitting itself together from frayed threads. One evening, As a cool autumn wind whispered through the pines, Elara found Thorne on the porch, staring out at the darkening woods. He was holding the small, unfinished carving of the starling she had found weeks ago. She sat beside him, and for a long time, neither spoke. Then, his voice low and rough with memory, he began to talk. He told her about Sarah, about her laugh, which he said sounded like wind chimes, and her gentle hands that could make anything grow. He told her how she had caught a fever during the great blizzard 3 years prior, while he was away on a logging contract, trying to earn enough money for a real glass window for their bedroom. He'd made it back through the snow just in time to hold her as she died, her last breath a soft, rattling sigh. "I failed her," he said, his voice cracking on the words. "I was supposed to be strong enough to protect her, and I wasn't. When Cora got sick, when I saw her lying there, burning up in the same way, I froze. The past had me. I was a coward." He turned to look at Elara, his eyes reflecting the first pale stars. "But you weren't. You fought. You stayed. You showed me that strength isn't about never falling. It's about getting back up and fighting for who you have left." He gently placed the unfinished bird in her hand. "I haven't touched this since she died. I think maybe it's time to finish it." In that moment, sharing the weight of his deepest wound, their bond was sealed, no longer an arrangement of convenience, but a partnership of souls. But the fragile peace they had built was not meant to last. Alistair and Beatrice Jennings were not people who accepted defiance. Their retaliation was insidious at first. The next time Thorne went to the general store, the proprietor, a man who had known him for years, suddenly couldn't meet his eyes, mumbling that he was fresh out of salt pork and ammunition. A fence post near their creek was mysteriously broken, allowing 2 of their precious few cattle to wander off. These were warnings, serpents' bites from the shadows. The true strike came one evening at dusk. Thorne was out in the far woods, checking his trap lines, and the children were inside. Elara had gone to the well to fetch the last bucket of water for the night. The air was still, the sky streaked with the dying embers of the day. She did not hear him approach until his shadow fell over her. It was Blackwood, the brutish trapper from the ridge, but he was not drunk this time. His eyes were cold and sober, and they held a snake's menacing glint. "Well, look who it is," he slurred, though his voice lacked the usual drunken stumble. "The little queen of the Lumberjack's castle." Elara straightened, her heart beginning to hammer against her ribs. "You should be on your way, Blackwood. It's late." He chuckled, a low, ugly sound, and took a step closer, blocking her path back to the cabin. "Oh, I'm on my way. All right." But a man gets thirsty, and a man gets curious. "Heard you made quite a scene in town, sticking up for this patch of dirt. A man like Alistair Jennings. He don't like being told no." The name, spoken aloud, confirmed her deepest fear. This was not a random encounter. This was a message. She tried to move past him, but he shot out a hand and grabbed her wrist, his grip like an iron band. "Come on now," he breathed, his breath foul. "You owe us all a little smile, after all that trouble." Before she could scream, before her terror could find a voice, a blur of motion exploded from the edge of the trees. It was Thorne. He moved not with the lumbering gait of a tired worker, but with the lethal speed of a cornered bear. There were no words, no warnings. Just one, clean, brutal punch that sent Blackwood sprawling into the dirt, out cold. Thorne stood over the unconscious man, his chest heaving, his knuckles already swelling and split. He didn't spare a glance for the man on the ground. His wild, dark eyes found Elara's. "You all right?" he asked, his voice a low growl. She could only nod, her body trembling. He strode over to her, gently taking her wrist from her own stunned grasp, his touch surprisingly soft as he examined the red marks Blackwood's grip had left behind. "No one," he said, his voice a vow, "touches you." Back inside the lamplit cabin, as Elara gently cleaned the blood from his knuckles with boiled water and a clean rag, the reality of their situation settled over them. This was more than intimidation. This was an attack. "He said Alistair's name," she whispered. Thorne nodded grimly, flexing his bruised hand. "They won't stop. Not until they have this land." They sat in silence for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then Elara spoke, her voice clear and steady. "Then we cannot just wait for them to strike again. We have to be ready. We have to fight back." Thorne looked at her, a flicker of surprise and admiration in his eyes. He saw not a frightened victim, but a determined partner. "You're right," he said. A new energy entered his voice, the weary resignation replaced by a hard edge of resolve. "The deed to this land. After Sarah died, I filed it at the local office, but the territory lines were redrawn. To be ironclad, the title needs to be registered with the territorial capital. I've put it off. It's a 3-day ride." A desperate, dangerous plan began to form between them. It was a terrible gamble. "I have to go," he said. "It's the only way to protect this place legally. If I have the federal deed, Jennings can't touch us." Elara's heart clenched with fear at the thought of him leaving, but she nodded. "I'll stay. The children and I will hold down the fort." Their gazes met, and in that look, a pact was made. This was their all-or-nothing moment. The following days were a whirlwind of grim preparation. Thorne spent hours sharpening his axe and cleaning his rifle. He took Elara and an apprehensive Gideon out to the woods and showed them both how to load and fire the heavy weapon, his instructions calm and precise. Elara, in turn, began a meticulous inventory of their food supplies, rationing flour and dried beans, preserving everything she could from her small, struggling garden. They were no longer just a family. They were a garrison, preparing for a siege. The first line had been drawn in the dirt, and they had chosen to stand their ground on the right side of it, together. The morning of Thorne's departure was cloaked in a heavy, unnatural stillness, as if the land itself knew the weight of his journey. The farewell was not one of tears or grand pronouncements. It was a moment of profound, quiet gravity. He stood before Elara on the porch, the rising sun casting long shadows behind them. He took her hands in his grip firm. 3 days, he said, his voice a low promise. Barricade the door at night. Keep the rifle close. You are stronger than you know, Elara. She looked into his tired, determined eyes and saw not a man leaving her, but a man fighting to come back to her. She simply nodded, her throat too tight for words, and squeezed his hands in return. It was enough. He mounted his horse, gave one last, long look at her and the children huddled in the doorway, and then he was gone, a solitary figure disappearing over the ridge, swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape. The silence he left behind was a palpable entity, a gaping void that was soon filled by fear. That first night, as Elara slid the heavy wooden bar across the cabin door, The sound echoed like a tomb ceiling. She and the 4 children were an island in a sea of encroaching darkness, and the weight of their protection settled squarely on her shoulders. The siege began the next afternoon. It started not with a bang, but with a presence. A lone rider appeared on the opposite ridge, a dark silhouette against the bright afternoon sky, watching them. It was Blackwood. He didn't do anything, just sat on his horse, a silent, menacing sentinel. Alistair Jennings was too clever to use overt violence. Not yet. That would bring Sheriff Clayton snooping. His plan was one of attrition, a slow, cruel tightening of a noose. He wanted to break their spirit, to make Elara feel so isolated and terrified that she would flee with the children before Thorne could ever return. The psychological war had begun. The next day, 2 more of Alistair's men joined Blackwood on the ridge. Their low laughter and jeering comments would drift down on the wind, just loud enough to be heard, designed to fray her nerves. That night, a fire bloomed in the woods near their northern fence line. It wasn't a wildfire, but a controlled, deliberate burn, close enough to fill the cabin with the smell of smoke and the terrifying orange glow of flames, a stark reminder of their vulnerability. Elara acted with a calm she didn't know she possessed. She roused a terrified Gideon and Samuel, and together they filled every bucket with water, creating a firebreak at the edge of their property. She worked through the night, her face smudged with soot, her arms aching, her voice a steady stream of commands that quelled the children's panic and replaced it with purpose. She was no longer the broken woman from the market. She was a general defending her fortress. The following morning, she discovered their small creek had been dammed upstream with fallen logs and rocks, the life-giving trickle of water to their garden and livestock reduced to a muddy seep. It was a crippling blow, a direct attack on their ability to survive. But as Alistair's men watched from the ridge, expecting to see despair, they saw something else. They saw Elara, armed with Thorne's heavy axe, and Gideon, with a small hatchet of his own, march to the creek and begin the back-breaking work of dismantling the dam. They worked for hours under the relentless sun, their defiance a silent scream that echoed across the valley. Inside the cabin, Elara was the unwavering center of their small, besieged world. She turned their fear into a weapon. They reinforced the window shutters, they rationed their remaining water, and in the evenings, she would gather them by the fire, not with stories of fear, but with tales of brave pioneers and stubborn homesteaders who refused to be broken. She was forging them into a family of fighters. On the morning of the 3rd day, the day Thorne was due to return, Alistair decided he had waited long enough. Frustrated by Elara's resilience, his arrogance got the better of him. He rode down from the ridge, Blackwood and another man flanking him, and trotted directly onto Thorne's land, stopping just yards from the cabin porch where Elara stood waiting, the heavy rifle held loosely in her hands. Gideon stood just inside the doorway behind her, his young face pale but set with determination. "This has gone on long enough," Alistair called out, his voice dripping with condescending authority. "You are trespassing on my property." Elara's voice was cold and clear, carrying easily in the still morning air. "You are the one trespassing, Alistair. This is Thorne's land." Alistair laughed, a humorless, ugly sound. "A deed filed by a half-literate lumberjack? It won't stand. I have the superior claim. Now, take those brats and get off my land before I have you removed." He dismounted, taking a swaggering step towards her. It was then that Elara played her final card, a piece of information she had gleaned from a distraught Delilah, who had confided in Doc Ephraim before fleeing town. "You talk so much about claims and heirs," she said, her voice dropping, taking on a new, dangerous edge. "But you could never have an heir, could you, Alistair? You called me a barren field for 2 years. You let your mother humiliate me, and you threw me away." She took a step forward, the rifle now held at the ready. But the problem was never with the soil. It was with the seed. The words struck Alistair with the force of a physical blow. His face went white, then a blotchy, furious red. The sneer vanished, replaced by the raw, panicked rage of a man whose deepest, most shameful secret had just been exposed in front of his own men. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably on his horse. "What is this nonsense?" Alistair stammered, his voice cracking. "Lies. The desperate lies of a worthless woman." He lunged for her, his face a mask of hate, his hand reaching to rip the rifle from her grasp. "I'll shut your mouth for good." In that split second, 2 things happened at once. A loud crack echoed from the cabin doorway as Gideon, seeing Elara in danger, fired the small pistol Thorne had left him into the air, a desperate, defiant warning shot. At the exact same moment, another sound filled the air, the thunder of approaching horses. Over the ridge, 2 riders appeared, moving at a full gallop. It was Thorne, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury, and beside him, wearing the silver star of the law, was Sheriff Clayton. They reined in their horses in a cloud of dust, cutting off Alistair's retreat. The sheriff took in the scene in an instant. Alistair menacing a woman and child, his men trespassing, a weapon just fired. Thorne vaulted from his horse, a rolled document clutched in his hand. He didn't even look at Alistair. He went straight to Elara, his eyes searching her face, his hand gently taking the rifle from her. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. She could only nod, a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. The sheriff dismounted, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt. "Jennings," he said, his voice hard as iron. "Looks to me like you're a long way from home." Alistair, trapped and exposed, sputtered, "This is my land." "She's a squatter." Thorne stepped forward and unfurled the document with a sharp snap. "Not according to the United States Territorial Office," he said, his voice ringing with authority. "This is a federally registered deed. My land, my home. And this," he said, gesturing to Elara and the children now gathered beside her, "is my family. Now get off my property." The siege was over. Sheriff Clayton looked from the official deed to Alistair's face, twisted with impotent rage and humiliation. "You heard him, Jennings," the sheriff said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Leave. Now. And if I hear you or your men have so much as looked at this ridge again, the only property you'll be claiming is a jail cell." Defeated, Alistair stared at Elara one last time, his eyes burning with a hatred that was now mixed with the bitter poison of his own exposed secret. He turned without a word, mounted his horse, and rode away, his men following like beaten dogs. Elara, Thorne, and the children stood together on the porch, watching them go, the long, dark shadow of their enemy finally receding down the hill, vanquished by the truth. As the dust settled on the path where Alistair Jennings and his men had retreated, an extraordinary peace descended upon the ridge. It was more than just the absence of a threat. It was a profound, cleansing stillness that seeped into the very bones of the house. That evening, the simple meal of rabbit stew and fresh bread felt like a banquet. The fire in the hearth seemed to burn brighter, its light casting warm, dancing shadows on the faces of the children, whose laughter, for the first time, was entirely free from the undertones of fear. They were safe. They were whole. Later, when the children were finally asleep, their small bodies peacefully entwined in their bedrolls, Elara and Thorne stood on the porch, shoulder to shoulder, looking out at the vast, star-dusted canvas of the night sky. The world was quiet, holding them in its gentle embrace. Thorne reached out and took her hand, his thumb gently stroking her knuckles. For a long while, he said nothing, but the story of their journey was told in that simple touch, the gratitude, the respect, the shared victory. "This is your home, Elara," he finally said, his voice a low rumble that was part of the night's symphony. "Not because I paid for you, not because you take care of my children, but because you are the heart of it. It's your home for as long as you'll have it." Elara leaned her head against his strong shoulder, a feeling of belonging so pure and powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "I'm not going anywhere, Thorne," she whispered. "I'm already home." He then reached into his pocket and pressed something into her palm. It was the small wooden starling. But it was no longer unfinished. He had completed it, its wings perfectly detailed, its tiny eyes painted with a lifelike glint. It was a promise fulfilled, a new life ready to take flight. A few months passed, and autumn painted the valley in brilliant strokes of gold and crimson. The harshness of the land began to soften, mirroring the healing of the family who lived on it. Life on the ridge found a new, joyful rhythm. The cabin, once a place of mere survival, was now a hive of warmth and activity. Elara's presence had woven itself into the fabric of their lives. She taught Cora her letters by the firelight, her patient voice a gentle murmur. She taught Samuel how to patch a tear in his own trousers, giving him a sense of pride. And with Gideon, a new relationship of deep, mutual respect had blossomed. He was no longer the angry, suspicious boy, but a thoughtful young man who worked alongside Thorne, learning the ways of the woods, his father's quiet strength now reflected in his own steady gaze. One afternoon, Elara walked into the cabin to find Gideon standing by the great stone hearth, a knife in his hand. Her heart skipped a beat before she saw what he was doing. On the heavy oak mantelpiece, where a T for Thorne and a faded S for Sarah had been carved long ago, he was carefully etching a new letter, an E. He looked up as she approached, a shy, proud look on his face. He didn't say a word, but the message was as clear as the morning sun. She was not a replacement for the mother he had lost, but a new, essential part of their story, her initial, now forever part of the heart of their home. The moment that truly sealed her place, however, came on a crisp afternoon when the air smelled of wood smoke and coming winter. Finn, who was now a confident toddler, was chasing a chicken in the yard when he tripped and fell, his knee landing hard on a sharp rock. A shocked silence was followed by a piercing wail. Thorne, who was splitting logs nearby, turned, but Finn, his face crumpled in pain and tears streaming down his cheeks, scrambled to his feet and ran past his father, launching himself directly into Elara's arms as she rushed out of the cabin. He buried his face in her dress, his small body shaking with sobs, and cried out the one word that made the entire world stand still. "Mama!" The word, so simple, so natural, hung in the air, echoing off the pines. Thorne froze, his axe held halfway in its swing, and a slow, wondrous smile spread across his face. The following spring, the garden that Elara had started with a handful of seeds in cracked, unforgiving soil exploded with life. It was a riot of color and abundance, with stubborn sunflowers reaching for the sky, heavy tomato vines bending their stakes, and cornstalks standing tall and proud. The house itself had changed. Thorne had built a new, sturdy porch, and the gaping hole in the bedroom wall was now filled with a real glass window that caught the morning light. It was a home transformed, reflecting the transformation of the family within. One evening, as they sat on the new porch swing Thorne had built, watching the children play a game of tag in the twilight, he turned to her. He held no ring, no grand token, only the quiet truth in his eyes. "Elara," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "You came here with nothing, and you gave us everything. Would you do me, and these children, the honor of taking our name?" And so, the woman who was sold for her silence found her voice. The barren field became a garden. The broken pieces were made whole. Years melted into decades. The children grew up, their own laughter eventually filling the house with a new generation. The railroad did come, but it curved around Thorne's Ridge, leaving the small homestead in its peaceful solitude. One crisp fall afternoon, Thorne, now a grandfather with lines of kindness etched around his eyes and silver in his hair, stood with his eldest grandson by the wooden archway that marked the entrance to their property. The boy looked up at the words carved carefully into the weathered wood. "Grandpa," he asked, "what does it mean?" Her worth was not in the blood she didn't bear. Thorne looked past the boy, his gaze settling on the porch where Elara sat, her own hair a crown of silver, humming a lullaby to a grandchild in her arms. He smiled, a lifetime of love in that simple expression. "It means," he said, his voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty, "that she gave birth to all the best parts of our lives. And on that ridge, where a family had refused to be sold or broken, the garden continued to grow, its roots running deeper than any sorrow, a testament to the fact that the most beautiful things in the world are never owned, but are grown, piece by piece, through the stubborn, relentless, and extraordinary power of love." From the dust and degradation of a cattle market, where a woman was sold for her perceived failings, a legacy was born. Elara's journey from a silent, broken possession to the fierce and unshakable heart of a family is a powerful testament to a profound truth. Our real worth is never determined by the cruel judgments of others, but is forged in the fires of our own resilience. She was called a barren field, yet from the soil of her compassion, she cultivated a garden of love and belonging that saved a family lost to grief. Thorne, a man frozen by the ghosts of his past, learned that true strength wasn't in the might of his axe, but in the courage to let his heart be mended and to fight for a future he never thought he deserved. Together, they faced down the greed and bitterness of the past, proving that a home is not a structure of wood and nails, but a fortress built from loyalty, courage, and the stubborn choice to stand together against the storm. Their story is a timeless reminder that family is not always a matter of blood, but of the bonds we choose to forge and defend. It teaches us that the most broken ground can yield the most beautiful blooms, and that love, in its purest form, is not about what we can produce, but about the care we pour into the lives we touch. If this story of grit, grace, and a love that was truly earned touched something deep within you, help us share its message. Hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own unshakable worth. Subscribe to our channel and ring that bell, so you never miss another story from the untamed heart of the American West, where love is rarely easy, but it is always, always worth the fight. Thank you for watching.